The gate guard's voice hit Alena Marsh before she even reached the iron doors. Not authorized. 3 words. That was all. Flat, cold, and delivered without a single glance in her direction. Alena stopped walking. The sealed document tube was still tucked under her arm, the wax crest of the high archive still intact. She had walked 4 corridors and 2 staircases to get here. She had signed 3 entry forms. She had been sent by the chief archivist himself, which meant this was not optional, and it was not unofficial, and it was not the kind of errand a junior archivist could simply abandon and walk back from. She looked at the man blocking the eastern gate. He was not what she had expected, though she was not sure what she had expected. The stories about Caelen were the kind that traveled the palace corridors the same way rumors did, fast, sideways, and getting bigger with every person who passed them along. He had reduced the senior court minister to tears in the middle of a formal reception. He had told a visiting duke from the Western Reaches something so cutting in 3 words that the man had refused to return for 2 consecutive diplomatic seasons. The palace steward had started routing official visitors through the northern entrance just to avoid him. And here he was. He was tall in the way that walls are tall, not impressive, just present. His uniform was dark and exactly correct, not a single button loose, not a single crease out of place. He had the kind of face that had decided a long time ago it was not going to give anything away and had kept that decision without breaking once. His eyes moved across the courtyard the way a soldier's eyes move, not resting, not searching, just covering ground. He had not looked at her directly. He did not look at anyone directly, she noticed. He looked past people, or above them, or through them, and it made everyone in his vicinity feel slightly less real. Alena squared her shoulders. I have a delivery for the inner chamber, she said. Sealed documents from the High Archive. Authorized under the chief archivist mark. He still did not look at her. Not authorized. Same 3 words. Same tone. Same direction, which was technically the middle distance somewhere over her left shoulder. The 2 soldiers standing on either side of the gate did not move. They had the particular stillness of people who had learned, through experience, that becoming invisible around Caelen was simply the safest option. One of them caught Elena's eye for a single second and then looked away, which told her everything. She was not going to get help from anyone in this courtyard. Alena took one breath and thought about what the chief archivist had said when he handed her this assignment. He had said it in the tone people use when they are warning you about something without technically warning you. He had said, Caelen guards that corridor. And then he had paused. And then he had said, just bring the documents back if it becomes impossible. She had thought that was strange phrasing at the time. Impossible. Now she understood. She looked down at the document tube in her hands. The wax seal was a deep red, slightly imperfect the way hand-pressed seals always are, the High Archive's crest pressed into it with a small chip on the upper left corner where the stamp had aged. She had carried it carefully all the way here. She looked back up at Caelen. He still was not looking at her. Who authorized the restriction on this corridor? She asked. A pause. Not because he was considering the question. Because he was deciding whether it was worth answering at all. Not authorized, he said. Alena felt the heat start at the back of her neck. She kept it out of her voice, which took more effort than she liked to admit. That is not an answer to my question. I asked who issued the restriction, not whether I am cleared for entry. Nothing. He looked at the courtyard gate instead. She was aware, with uncomfortable clarity, that several people had slowed their walking in the vicinity. A pair of court attendants near the archway. A messenger boy who had stopped pretending to sort his satchel. Word traveled fast in this palace, and everyone in hearing range was about to go tell someone that they had watched a junior archivist get rewarded at the eastern gate, same as everyone else. Alena turned to leave. She had not decided to turn. Her feet simply moved in the direction of the thing that was not humiliation, which happened to be the corridor leading back the way she came. Her hands kept the document tube steady. Her face did the thing it did when she needed it not to show anything, which was to go very slightly still, like water before a freeze. She was 3 steps away when it happened. Not a sound. Not exactly. Something landed inside her chest, behind the sternum, the way a word does when you read it and feel it before you understand it. 4 words. Formed with difficulty, like something dragged through a narrow space it was not meant to fit through. Not spoken. She had no word for what it was. It arrived the way a memory arrives, except it was not hers. She stopped. She turned around. Caelen was standing exactly where he had been. His face had not changed. His posture had not changed. He was looking at the courtyard gate with the same expression he had been wearing since she arrived, which was the expression of a man who had been standing outside in various weather for a long time and had decided to outlast it. His mouth had not moved. Elena looked at him. He did not look back at her. But something in the exact way he was not looking at her was different from the way he had been not looking at her 1 minute ago. Before, she had been furniture. Now she was a door he was trying to decide about. She did not know how she knew the difference. She just did. She stood there for 3 full seconds, the document tube under her arm, the wax seal unbroken, the messenger boy 10 feet to her left absolutely not minding his own business. The 2 courtyard soldiers were looking very hard at the middle distance. Then she turned and walked away. Her hands were steady. She made sure of it. She did not look back again. But the entire walk back through the corridors she kept reaching for that sensation behind her sternum, pressing at it the way you press a bruise to see if it is real. It was real. 4 words, not 3. A sentence. Incomplete, maybe. Fractured at the edges. But unmistakably deliberate. Not cruelty, not dismissal. Something else entirely. She did not write it down when she got back to the archive. She was an archivist, which meant her first instinct about almost everything was to name it and file it. But this she kept. She put the document tube on her desk. The wax seal was still intact. She sat down, put both hands flat on the table, and stared at the wall for a long time. The chief archivist appeared in the doorway an hour later, took one look at her face, and did not ask what had happened at the eastern gate. He looked at the document tube, still sealed, still undelivered, and then he looked at Elena, and he said nothing. That was also information. Elena picked up her pen and opened her translation work and said nothing either. But she thought about those 4 words all the way until the night watch bell rang, and then she thought about them some more after that, in the quiet of the archive's upper room where she slept when the work ran late. 4 words. Not 3. Someone was in there behind that silence. Someone who had, for one unguarded second, reached through whatever was sealing him shut. And for reasons she could not yet name, he had reached toward her. The second time Elena encountered Caelen, she was not supposed to be in that corridor at all. The palace chamberlain had called her to the inner chamber with 2 hours' notice and a written summons that used the phrase matters of linguistic urgency, which in palace language meant someone needed something translated and they needed it now and the usual interpreter was unavailable. Elena had grabbed her reference volumes, tied her hair back with the piece of cord she kept looped around her wrist for exactly this kind of situation, and taken the fastest route. The fastest route went through the eastern corridor. She did not realize this until she was already in it. Caelen was at the far end, standing at his post the way he always stood, not leaning, not restless, just present in the specific way that large immovable things are present. The corridor between them was long and straight and entirely unhelpful. Elena kept walking. She was not going to turn around and take the long way because of a feeling in her chest. He did not say not authorized. She was not going to the gate. She was walking through a corridor, which was a thing people were permitted to do, and she was doing it with the posture of someone who was fully aware of this. She was 6 feet from him when it happened again. Not 4 words this time. More. A sentence and a half, broken in the middle, arriving in that strange behind-the-ribs way that had nothing to do with her ears. She did not understand all of it. The words were clear enough. The intent behind them was something she would need longer to figure out. She walked past him. She did not stop. She did not look at him. She kept her breathing even. But her pen hand was doing that thing where it wanted to write something down, which meant her brain had registered something her consciousness was still catching up to. She made it to the inner chamber, translated 3 pages of old wolf-packed boundary law, corrected 2 significant misreadings that had apparently been causing diplomatic friction for 4 years, and was dismissed with a compliment so restrained it was almost an insult. On the way back, she took the long route. She told herself it was because she wanted to think. It was also because she needed time before she had to walk past him again and pretend that the signal she was receiving was not there. By the end of that week she had walked through the Eastern Corridor 4 times. Not all of them were the fastest route. She began carrying a small notebook, separate from her official archive journals, plain cover, no label. She wrote things in it that she did not yet understand, in a notation system she invented specifically because she did not want anyone else to be able to read it. This was the archivist in her. She could not leave things unnamed. The transmissions, she had started calling them that, privately, in her head, because it was the most accurate word she had, arrived at irregular intervals. Sometimes she walked the full length of the Eastern Corridor and received nothing. Sometimes she was 3 rooms away in the archive and something arrived without warning, mid-sentence in a translation, a fragment landing in her chest like a stone dropped from a height. She began to understand certain things. The 3 words he said aloud, always the same 3, always that same flat tone, were not cruelty. Or they were cruelty, technically, the way a locked door is technically a door. But underneath them, in the frequency she alone seemed to receive, there was always something else. Not what he meant to say. What he would have said if the 3 words were not the only ones he had access to. She thought about that. She thought about it a lot. She had translated enough old pact law by now to know that punishment bindings were real. That they took different forms. That some of them were self-imposed, which was a category that sat in the legal text without much explanation, as though the scholars who had written the text had also not quite known what to do with it. She did not bring this up with the chief archivist. She did not bring it up with anyone. But she started paying closer attention to the Wolfpack scrolls, specifically the sections on voice restriction clauses, in the way that archivists pay attention to things they are not technically supposed to be interested in, thoroughly, quietly, and with the kind of focus that looks from the outside like ordinary diligence. 3 weeks after her first visit to the Eastern Gate, the Chamberlain assigned her a permanent post in the archive's inner reference room, which was adjacent to the Eastern Corridor. She moved her reference volumes and her plain cover notebook and the small jar of extra ink she always kept on her desk. She arranged them the way she always arranged them. She opened the window that faced the courtyard because the air in palace interiors tended toward the stale. She could see the gate from that window. She told herself she had not noticed this until after she sat down. 2 days into the new posting, she was walking through a section of the packed scrolls that dealt with cross-speech clauses, specifically the subcategory of voluntary silence bindings, when she came across a phrase she had not encountered before. Old tongue, Northern dialect, the kind of compound construction that required 3 different reference volumes to untangle. She untangled it. She read the result. She sat with it for a moment, the pen in her hand and the meaning on the page in front of her, and felt the particular sensation of a piece fitting into a space that had been waiting for it without her knowing the space was there. The phrase did not mean what the standard gloss said it meant. The standard gloss rendered it roughly as sealed by choice. The actual meaning, once the Northern dialect-specific compound logic was applied, was closer to sealed by grief, held by hand. There is a difference. A significant one. She wrote it in the plain cover notebook. Then, because she was alone in the archive and because the phrasing was interesting and because she was in the habit of speaking translations aloud to check the rhythm of them, she read the original phrase out loud. Just to herself. Just to hear how it sat in the air. What happened next was not gradual. From the corridor outside the archive door, 12 feet of stone wall away, there was the sound of a hand striking a surface. Not violently. Just landing. The way a hand lands when someone needs to stop moving and needs something solid to stop against. Everything in Elena went still. She did not look at the door. Then the transmission arrived. Not a fragment. Not a half sentence interrupted by whatever sealed him. A complete thought. Clear. Unguarded in a way that none of the others had been, because this one had come loose by accident, pushed through by whatever that phrase had done when she said it aloud. She would not write this one in the notebook. Not because she was afraid to name it. Because some things are not meant to be filed. Some things are meant to stay in the body, in the behind the ribs place where they land. She closed the scroll. She put her pen down. Outside, she heard his footsteps resume, deliberate, even, the patrol continuing as though nothing had happened. She picked her pen back up and returned to her work. But her handwriting was slightly different for the rest of that afternoon. Smaller. More careful. The kind of handwriting a person produces when some part of them is paying attention to something else entirely. She had not spoken to him. He had not acknowledged her in any way that the two corridor soldiers or the passing court attendants or the palace steward's deputy would have registered as communication. But something had shifted. She knew it the same way she had known, at the gate, that the 3 words and the 4 words were different. Not because anyone had told her. Because she was an archivist and she had been trained to notice when one thing became another thing without announcing itself. The question was what she was going to do with what she now knew. She looked at the scroll in front of her. Sealed by grief, held by hand. She looked at the window, which faced the courtyard, which she had absolutely not noticed until after she sat down. She thought, I should tell the chief archivist about the misgloss. She thought, I should not tell anyone else anything at all. She looked back at her work. She did not look at the door. But she left the window open for the rest of the week, because the courtyard air was better than the palace interior, and for no other reason than that. The palace had eyes the way old buildings always do, not the stones themselves, but the people stationed in front of them. A guard changes at the 3rd bell. A chambermaid passes the upper gallery twice before noon. The steward's secretary takes the southern corridor to the kitchens every morning at the same time, and on the way back he always pauses at the 2nd landing because there is a window there with a view of the eastern courtyard, and some habits outlast the reasons for them. Alena had been in the inner reference room for 22 days when she became aware that she had become something worth watching. It was not obvious at first. It rarely was. It started with glances that were slightly too deliberate. A pause in a conversation that stopped 1 second after she entered the room. The way the steward's secretary had begun taking a slightly longer route that happened to bring him past her window at the 3rd afternoon hour, which was roughly when Caelen's patrol route brought him along the eastern corridor's inner-facing wall. She catalogued these things. It was what she did. On the 23rd day, the summons arrived. It was written in the palace chancellor's hand, which was identifiable by its extreme neatness, the kind of handwriting produced by a man who had decided that every letter he formed was a statement about who he was. The note requested her presence in the West Study at her earliest convenience, and used the phrase "I hope we can speak plainly," which in Alena's experience meant the opposite was about to happen. She went at the 2nd afternoon bell. Chancellor Vernon Holt was already standing when she arrived, which told her he had been waiting and wanted her to know he had been waiting. He was a compact man in his late 50s, with silver at his temples and a face built for expressions of measured concern. He had served 3 successive rulers of this territory and had survived each transition not through loyalty but through the specific skill of being indispensable while remaining technically blameless. He smiled when Alena entered. It was a good smile. The kind you have to look at carefully to see the working parts behind it. "Archivist Marsh," he said. "Thank you for coming." "Chancellor," she said. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, which she took, and he settled into his own chair with the ease of a man who considers every room he sits in to be his room. On the desk between them was a cup of tea. He had not offered her one. This was also information. "I will be direct," he said. He was not going to be direct. "You have been stationed in the inner reference room for nearly a month now." He folded his hands on the desk. "Your work there has been noted. The translation corrections you made on the boundary law documents were quite significant. Thank you. In the course of your work," he said, his tone remaining exactly as pleasant as it had been, "you have necessarily spent considerable time in proximity to the eastern corridor. A pause. And to its guard. Alena said nothing. I am going to ask you something, he said, and I want you to understand that my only concern here is the security of the inner chambers and the well-being of those who serve in them. She folded her hands in her lap, which was something she did when she needed her face to stay neutral and her hands to stop being a liability. Of course. Has Caelen said anything to you? There it was. Said anything. The phrasing was careful. It did not specify aloud or otherwise. It left room. Vernon Holt was a man who left room in questions the same way hunters left room in traps, enough space to walk into without noticing the mechanism until it had already closed. Alena thought about the plain cover notebook in the inner reference room. She thought about the translation she had spoken aloud and the hand that had landed against stone outside the door. She thought about a complete thought arriving in her chest, unguarded, in a voice she was still learning the shape of. She said, "He has said 3 words to me. The same 3 words he says to everyone." This was true. The Chancellor studied her face. He was good at this. His expression did not shift. You have not found his manner to be unusual in any way. No particular attention paid to you. No communication that you would describe as outside the normal range of his duties. She looked at him steadily. He does not communicate with me, Chancellor. He is not known for communicating with anyone. Another pause. Slightly longer this time. He was a man who used silences the same way he used questions, to see what came rushing into them. Indeed, he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, almost as though the thought had just arrived instead of having been prepared, we have some interest in knowing whether he has been transmitting any, how to put this, sensitive intelligence through unconventional means. There are concerns about certain information he may have retained from his time on the northern border. Alena kept her expression the same. I understand the concern. I am an archivist, not an intelligence officer. If there were something of that nature occurring, I would not be the appropriate person to recognize it. Quite. He smiled again. Though archivists do tend to notice details others miss. It is the nature of the work. It is, she agreed. She did not say anything else. She waited. She was good at waiting. 2 years of archival work teaches you that silence is not empty, that what people fill it with tells you more than what they actually say. Vernon Holt filled it with a reassurance that she was not in any difficulty, that this was simply a routine inquiry, that he appreciated her candor, and that her ongoing work on the packed scrolls was of great value to the palace. She thanked him. She left. She was in the corridor outside the West study, walking at a normal pace toward nothing in particular, when she became aware that her heart rate was slightly elevated. Not from fear. From the specific sensation of having held a line and not letting anyone see the effort of it. She turned left. She did not plan to take the route that passed the eastern corridor. That is what she told herself later. Caelen was at the end of it, as he always was. Patrol position. Facing the courtyard gate. And Vernon Holt was there. Not directly, he had taken a different path, arrived a different way, was moving through the outer edge of the courtyard with 2 of his people behind him. He was not looking at the corridor. He appeared to be consulting a document. She saw the exact moment he became aware of her, and she saw the exact moment he registered that she had returned from the West study and was now standing 12 feet from Caelen. She did not stop walking. She kept her pace even. She did not look at Caelen. What happened in the next 5 seconds was not something anyone in the courtyard would have described as communication. Caelen turned his head. Not toward her. Toward the Chancellor. He said 3 words. The same 3 words he said to everyone. Flat, cold, delivered without inflection. The 2 men accompanying Vernon Holt both flinched. A visible, involuntary, full-body flinch, the kind that bypasses everything rational and goes straight to the part of the nervous system that has opinions about personal safety. The Chancellor himself did not flinch. He was better than that. But Alena, watching from the corridor entrance, saw his hand tighten slightly on the document he was holding, just once, just for a second. Then Caelen turned back to the gate. Vernon Holt continued crossing the courtyard at the same pace, and he was a composed enough man that no one would have known anything had happened. But Alena knew. She had heard the 3 words. She had also heard, beneath them, in the frequency she was no longer surprised by but had not yet stopped marveling at, what the 3 words actually meant when they landed in Caelen's direction. Not cruelty. A warning. She stood at the corridor entrance for exactly 2 seconds longer than she should have, and then she continued walking. Behind her, she heard his footsteps shift. Not following her. He did not follow people. It was more like something settling, the way a large, still thing settles when a threat has passed. She turned a corner. She stopped. She put both hands against the wall, flat-palmed, the stone cool against her fingers, and she breathed. Once. Twice. A third time. Then she went back to the inner reference room and opened the packed scrolls and walked until the evening bell. She did not write anything in the plain cover notebook that night. But she sat with it on the desk in front of her, closed, unopened, and thought about a man who had chosen 3 words out of what must be a genuine and ongoing silence, who had used them just now not as an insult but as the only shield he had available. She thought about who that shield had been pointed toward. She thought about Vernon Holt's hand, tightening on that document. She thought, the Chancellor is going to find a way to use me. He has not decided how yet but he is going to try. She pulled the notebook to her and wrote 3 words of her own. Not his. Hers. A note to herself, in her own notation, that no one else would be able to read. Then she closed it, stacked it under the reference volumes, and went to bed. In the upper corner of the inner reference room, there was a small window that looked out not onto the courtyard but onto the archive's internal well, a narrow shaft of space between the building's older and newer wings, built in the gap between 2 centuries of construction. It let in light but not much else. On clear days the shaft ran gold from the second bell onward and then went grey in the late afternoon, and Alena had gotten used to the shift. It was a reliable thing in an environment that had, over the past few weeks, become steadily less reliable. She was working when the delegation from the northern border arrived. She did not know they had arrived at first. The palace absorbed large events the way a river absorbs fallen branches. It went around them, kept moving, showed the surface disturbance only if you were watching the right section. She found out from the Chamberlain's deputy, who came to the inner reference room in the late morning with the look of someone who had been walking very fast for the past hour and had not entirely stopped even now that he was standing still. He said the Alpha King required her specific translation expertise for an official hearing. He said the northern delegation had brought testimonies in Old Tongue dialect. He said the hearing was in 2 days. He left before she could ask questions. Alena sat with this information for a moment. Then she opened the relevant section of her packed scrolls and began reviewing. She already knew more about the northern border situation than anyone had told her. She knew it from the scrolls themselves, from the legal frameworks she had been translating for months, from the gaps in the documentation that were, to an archivist, as readable as the text itself. She knew it from the voluntary silence binding clause she had found in the restricted section, the one the standard gloss had gotten wrong. She knew it from the transmissions. Not the content of them. He was not careless, and whatever seal existed on his voice, it did not seem to leak information. But the emotional register she received was real, and it had told her things that the official record could never have told her. Grief. Not the sharp kind. The kind that has been carried long enough to become load-bearing. For 2 days she prepared. On the morning of the hearing, she arrived at the former chamber before the delegation. She arranged her materials. She positioned herself at the translation table, which was to the left of the main floor, angled so she could see both the delegation seats and the documentation table and the Alpha King's dais. She had not thought about where Caelen would be positioned. She should have thought about where Caelen would be positioned. He was at the back corner of the chamber, to the right of the main doors, in the guard standing position. Exactly as far from the proceedings as protocol permitted. Exactly as present as his role required. He was looking at the doors. He was not looking at her. Alena looked at her materials. The delegation came in. 7 people, northern border manner, which meant they held their faces differently from the palace people, not guarded in the same way but guarded in their own way, shaped by a different kind of caution. Their leader was a woman in her 60s named Dethroned, who had the bearing of someone who had been in rooms like this before and had learned to wait them out. The Alpha King entered last. Alena had seen him before, in the way you see figures of authority in a large institution, present, significant, peripheral to your actual work. He was younger than she expected when she first arrived at the palace. He had the look of someone who had inherited enormous weight and was still deciding how to carry it, which was not something she had been able to name the first time she had seen him, but which she could name now. The hearing began. Dethroned spoke in old-tongue northern dialect, the kind that had been isolated in the border territory for long enough that it had developed compounds and constructions that did not appear in any of the main reference texts. Alena translated sentence by sentence, steady, matching her pace to the speaker's, keeping her voice even and her word choices precise. The testimony described the events at the northern border 2 years ago. She did not look at Caelen. She translated. The words came through her like water through a channel, and she kept the channel clean, and she did not let anything she knew or felt affect the translation because that was the job and the job mattered. 40 minutes in, Dethroned said a phrase that Alena had not encountered in any of her preparation. She stopped. Not visibly. From the outside she simply paused in the way translators pause, thinking, reaching, checking. But inside the pause was longer and harder. The phrase was a northern compound, for elements, and the standard construction would give her one reading, but the northern dialect-specific logic pulled it toward another, and the two readings had entirely different implications for what was being said about the event being described. One reading placed responsibility on a systemic failure. The other placed it on a specific decision made by a specific person. She had 2 seconds to choose. She was aware, at the edge of her awareness, of the chamber waiting. Of Vernon Holt at the documentation table, stylus ready. Of the Alpha King on the dais, still, watchful. Of Dethroned, who had stopped speaking and was watching Alena with the patience of someone who knew this phrase was difficult and was willing to wait for it to be handled correctly. The transmission arrived. Not a full sentence. A word. One specific word, the correct northern dialect term for the second reading, the one that required the specific understanding of how those 4 compound elements work together. Given without preamble. Without explanation. Just the word, clean and correct, offered through the fracture, at the exact moment she needed it. She looked at him. She could not help it. It was involuntary, 1 second, the way your eyes go to the source of a sound before your brain has a chance to intervene. Caelen was looking at her. Not past her. Not through her. Directly at her. For the first time since the gate, since the beginning of all of this. She held it for 1 second. Then she turned back to the chamber and said the word. She used his word. His real northern dialect term, the one the standard text did not carry, the one that could only have come from someone who had been there and heard it spoken by people who lived it. The hearing chamber went quiet. Not the quiet of confusion. The quiet of a room in which something true has been said, and the room knows it, and is adjusting to the weight of it. Dethroned looked at the Alpha King. The Alpha King looked at the translation table. Vernon Holt's stylus had stopped moving. Alena kept her eyes on Dethroned and waited for the testimony to continue. It continued. She translated. But something had shifted in the room's air the way air shifts when a window opens that has been closed too long, not dramatically, not visibly, just a change in what could be breathed. She did not look at Caelen again. She did not need to. She already knew, from 1 second of direct eye contact and 1 word passed through the only channel he had, that the next part of this was not going to be simple. That what Vernon Holt had been building in the West study was going to find its shape. That the word she had just used, correct, necessary, entirely justified, was going to be used by someone to make a case that she was receiving things she had not been given permission to receive. She translated the remaining testimony with the same precision she had brought to the first 40 minutes. When the hearing closed and the chamber began to clear, she collected her materials without hurrying. She kept her movements ordinary. She did not look at the corner where Caelen was standing. But as she reached the chamber door, she heard it. Not through the channel. Not through the frequency behind her ribs. Through the actual air, faintly, because she was close enough to the door and the chamber had mostly emptied, and what remained of the hearing's former silence was thin enough to let the sound through. His exhale. Just that. One breath released, controlled, the kind of breath that has been held for a long time. The kind that a person lets out when something they have been waiting to happen has finally happened, and now they have to figure out what comes after. She did not stop walking. But she carried that breath with her all the way to the inner reference room, and she sat down at her desk, and she put both hands flat on the table, and she thought about a word she had not known until today, spoken into her by someone who had carried it for 2 years without being able to give it to anyone. Vernon Holt moved on the 3rd day after the hearing. Alena had known it was coming. She had known it the way you know weather is coming when the air changes before the sky does, nothing visible, but something in the pressure that tells you to take note of where the exits are. The formal inquiry notice arrived on a Tuesday. It was worded with the same precision as all of Vernon Holt's communications, the kind of language that was technically neutral and practically an accusation. The substance of it was this: there was a concern that Alena Marsh, junior archivist, had been receiving unauthorized transmissions from the Alpha King's guard Wolf, Caelen Doran, and that these transmissions may have included restricted information regarding the Northern Border incident, and that this information may have influenced the outcome of the official hearing. The formal inquiry would take place in 3 days. Alena sat with the notice for 20 minutes. Then she went to the chief archivist. He read the notice twice, which was one more time than she had ever seen him need for anything, and then he set it down with the careful movement of a man handling something he would prefer not to have touched. "I will write a supporting statement regarding your conduct in this posting," he said. "Thank you. It will address your professional qualifications, your translation accuracy, and the independence of your work." "I understand." He looked at her over the top of his reading lenses. "Is there anything else I should know before I write it?" There were several answers to that question. Alena chose the one that was most useful. "My translation in the hearing was accurate. The word I used in the Wen testimony is the correct Northern dialect rendering of that specific compound. I can document the linguistic basis for the choice. Can you document where the specific rendering came from?" Silence. "I thought not," the chief archivist said quietly. Not unkindly. Alena returned to the inner reference room. She began preparing her documentation of the Northern dialect compound, building the linguistic case from the reference text she had, which was a solid case, a defensible case, a case that stopped short of explaining everything but did not need to explain everything to be sufficient. She worked until the evening bell and then kept working. The plain cover notebook sat at the edge of her desk, closed. She did not look at it. At the second night bell, she heard footsteps in the eastern corridor. The patrol rhythm was distinct. She had memorized it without meaning to, in the same way you memorize any sound that is always there, the pattern and the pace and the specific way the footsteps sounded at this hour compared to midday, when the corridors were full of other sounds to absorb them. She put her pen down. She went to the window, the one that looked onto the courtyard, and stood there in the lamplight, not framed in it, just standing to one side where the light was less direct. Caelen stopped in the corridor below the window. He did not look up. He never looked up. But he stopped. She said nothing aloud. She had no way to send what she received. The channel, whatever it was, only went one direction. She was the receiver. He was the source. She waited. The transmission arrived slowly. More controlled than the accidental one from the archive doorway, more deliberate than the word in the hearing chamber. He was choosing this. Choosing to say it, knowing she would receive it, trusting, or deciding to trust, that she would know what to do with it. He said, "Do not defend me in that room." Not a question. Not a request with softening around it. Just the statement, clean, the kind of statement a person makes when they have thought about it long enough to remove the uncertainty. She stood at the window with both hands resting on the frame. She thought, this is exactly the wrong thing to say to an archivist, because archivists do not leave things undefended. That is the entire job. You find the correct record, you establish what it says, and you defend it against every misreading. She thought, he knows that. He is saying it anyway. She turned away from the window and went back to her desk. She looked at the documentation she had spent the evening building. Pages of it. Precise, sourced, defensible. She kept the pages. But she added 3 more, which she had not planned to write. A formal accounting of her translation methodology for the hearing, cross-referenced with packed law record-keeping protocol, which established clearly that the translation choices she had made were linguistic in nature and had been verified against the primary text before the hearing began. She had done that. She had prepared. She had checked her work against the text she had. She had also received the word through a channel that no document could explain. Both things were true. She was not going to pretend the second thing was not true, and she was not going to pretend it was the first thing either. She was going to walk into that formal inquiry and tell the specific truth, which was that her translation was accurate and documentable, and she was going to let that stand on its own, and she was not going to offer anything else unless she was directly asked. She was not going to defend him. Not because he had asked her not to. Because he had not needed her to. He had never needed her to, and she understood that now in a way she had not been able to articulate until this moment. The formal inquiry took place in the lower council chamber, which was a room built for exactly this kind of proceeding: long table, stone walls, the particular quality of silence that comes from a room in which difficult things have been decided often enough that the difficulty has soaked into the architecture. Elena sat at one end. Vernon Holt sat at the other. 3 senior officials occupied the long sides between them, and at the head of the table sat the Alpha King, which told her that someone had decided this was significant enough to require his presence. Caelen was not in the room. He had been asked not to attend. The inquiry notice had specified this. Elena had read that line 3 times. Vernon Holt presented his case. He was good at this. He was the kind of man who had spent decades building structures that looked like logic and functioned like pressure, and this one was no different. He presented the observable facts: Elena's proximity to Caelen over the past month, the word used in the hearing, the absence of any documented source for that specific linguistic rendering, and he assembled them into a shape that was not technically an accusation of wrongdoing but was exactly one step away from it at all times. He did not raise his voice. He did not use charged language. He simply built the shape and let the room look at it. Elena responded with her documentation. She walked through the linguistic basis for her translation choice, the reference materials she had used in her preparation, the methodology she had applied in the hearing. She was precise. She was thorough. She was, as far as any of it went, entirely truthful. She was halfway through her 3rd page when the chamber door opened. Everyone at the table turned. Caelen stood in the doorway. He had not been invited. He had been specifically excluded. And he was standing in the doorway of a formal inquiry presided over by the Alpha King with the exact expression he wore at the Eastern Gate: no urgency, no apology, just presence. Vernon Holt began to speak. Caelen looked at him. 3 words. The Chancellor closed his mouth. It was not the words themselves. It was never just the words themselves, Elena understood now. It was the fact that no one in this palace had ever heard him say anything else, so when he said those 3 words everyone in the room received them through 2 years of accumulated context, and the context was not kind. The Alpha King said, very quietly, Caelen. Caelen looked at him. Something passed between them, not the frequency she received, something older and more direct, the particular thing that passes between 2 people who have known each other long enough that the words are optional. The Alpha King said, speak. The room waited. Caelen stood at the door. He did not move into the room. He did not sit down. He stood the way he always stood, except that every person at the long table was looking at him directly, which was not something that happened to him. People looked past him, or at him from the corner of their eye, or pointedly away. They did not look at him the way this room was looking at him, with the full weight of a formal proceeding and nowhere else to put their attention. Elena looked at him too. He found her once, a single pass of his eyes across the table, and she held it. She did not look away. She did not try to communicate anything. She just looked at him the way you look at someone you have been receiving for a month without being able to speak to them, wanting them to know, without being able to say it, that you are here, and you are listening, and whatever happens next, that part has not changed. He looked away. He opened his mouth. What came out was not 3 words. The voice was rough in the way a voice is rough when it has been unused, not broken, not weak, just not practiced, carrying the specific quality of something that has been held in a small space for too long and is now in a larger one. It adjusted as he spoke, sentence by sentence, finding itself. He said what had happened at the northern border. Not the official version, which existed in the records Alena had been translating, and not Vernon Holt's implication, and not the delegation's careful testimony. His version. The specific and particular truth of what he had witnessed and what he had done and what he had not been able to do, and what those things had cost, and why the cost had felt like something he was not permitted to recover from on his own timeline. He said what the 3 words had meant. Every time. In every corridor, at every gate, to every minister and duke and chambermaid and junior archivist standing at the eastern gate with a sealed document under her arm. He said it the way you say something when you have not said anything for 2 years and your voice is doing its best but your chest is doing something that your voice cannot fully handle. Alena kept her hands flat on the table. The chamber was very quiet. When he finished, he stopped. He did not add anything. He did not fill the silence with the reassurances or qualifications that people attach to difficult truths in formal settings. He said what he had to say and then he let it be in the room. The Alpha King looked at Vernon Holt. Vernon Holt was very still. The Alpha King looked at Alena. She met his eyes and nodded once, which she had not planned to do, and which she was not sure she could have explained. The Alpha King looked at Caelen. This inquiry is closed, he said. He said something else after that, directly to the Chancellor, in a tone that Alena could hear but that she would not repeat because some things said in formal chambers are meant for the people in them and no one else. Then he stood and left, and the senior official stood and left, and Vernon Holt stood with the careful deliberateness of a man who is choosing, in this exact moment, how he is going to reconstruct his position going forward. He left without looking at Alena. He did not look at Caelen at all. The chamber emptied. Alena gathered her documentation pages and stacked them and put them in order and put them in her folder and took a breath and then another breath and then stood up. Caelen was still in the doorway. She walked toward it. Toward him. There was no other exit. He stepped aside. She stopped. Not because she had decided to. Because she was in the doorway and he was in the doorway and there was a particular quality to the silence between them that she had been living inside for a month and it felt different now, in the open air of the corridor, with his voice still in the room behind them. She looked at him. He was looking at the corridor wall. Then he looked at her. Directly, again, and she thought, he is learning how to do this. How to look at a person and let them see that he is looking. He reached into the inner pocket of his uniform and produced something she recognized immediately. The document tube. Her document tube. Sealed, wax crest intact, the small chip on the upper left corner where the stamp had aged, exactly as she had carried it to the eastern gate on her first day in this corridor. He held it out. She took it. Their hands did not touch. There was a half-inch of space between his fingers and hers as the transfer happened, which she was aware of with a precision that was disproportionate to the moment. She looked down at the tube. Then up at him. He said nothing. She said nothing. This was not a silence shaped like the ones she had been standing in for the past month. Those silences were full, pressure and frequency and the specific texture of things that could not come true. This one was different. This one was just 2 people standing in a doorway with nothing between them that was not meant to be there. She tucked the document tube under her arm. She thought about the first day she had carried it. The walk through 4 corridors and 2 staircases. The wax seal, the crest, the 3 words that were supposed to end the errand and had instead started something she still did not have a name for. She thought, I should say something. She thought, he said more in that chamber than he has said in 2 years, and there is nothing I could add to it. She nodded once. She walked into the corridor. Behind her, she heard his footsteps resume, the even, deliberate pace of the patrol, continuing as it had continued every day for 2 years, except that something in the rhythm was different now. Slightly. The way a weight shifts when something else has been set down. She did not look back. But she kept her left hand on the document tube all the way to the inner reference room, and she set it on the desk in front of her, still sealed, and she sat down, and she put both hands flat on the table. The window was open. The afternoon air came in clean off the courtyard. She did not open the document tube. She thought it was always going to get delivered. It just needed to go the long way around. She picked up her pen and opened the plain cover notebook and held it for a moment, the pen above the first empty page she had left. Then she put the pen down, and she closed the notebook, and she left the window open, and she started on the next translation. The document tube sat on the corner of the desk. Still sealed. For now, that was enough.